Thank you very much, Angie, for introducing me, and thank you to the Committee of 100 for inviting me to moderate this panel on US-China Strategic Trust. As a reporter here in Beijing, I spend a lot of my time trying to identify individuals who can provide both authoritative commentary on US-China relations, but also insight into what's going on behind the scenes. And we're very fortunate to have with us today two people uniquely qualified to provide that insight. Professor Shen DINGLI is one of China's leading international relations scholars, professor at the prestigious Fudan University. He has taught and researched a broad range of subjects, US-China relations, China's foreign and defense policies, non-proliferation issues. He's worked both in China and in the US, but he's also advised the Chinese government, both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Commerce, and he's also done some consulting for the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. Paul Hanley also has a very interesting and varied background. He is a veteran not just of the US military, in which he served at one point as an advisor on China to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But he's also had about 20 years in US government service and has worked in the White House under two presidents, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And latterly worked as the China director in the White House. He now heads the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center, where he's doing some very interesting work, providing a platform for Chinese and international scholars to come together and study some of the issues we're going to be talking about. So thank you very much both for being on this panel, and I hope you'll be as forthright with us as you are with me in private on these issues, help to decipher some of the official rhetoric. Just a few words from me. In the media, we like to talk about US-China relations as being at a sort of historical turning point. In fact, we probably use the term a little too much. I was meeting with a Chinese friend who's an editor of a newspaper the other day, and he was complaining to me. He said, "Jeremy, if I added up all the times you describe a historical turning point in your coverage of China, then every week, by the end of the week, we'd have gone 360 degrees. We'd be back at the same point." But in my defense, that's possibly not a bad metaphor for US-China relations, because the dynamics of the relationship are changing. There are these sort of tectonic shifts going on.
Each would deny the other's legitimacy. Each would compete for hegemony. No, we are not. We are partners. We work under market economy principle and to build wealth together. And let's try to respect each other. And China knows there are still some problems. China has changed from its old identity, a small version of the Union, to deny the US. We no longer think about to subvert the US social system, the way of living. But we know that the US still has some problem with our political institution. But over time, this seems to be manageable. But with China's very rapid rise, US would be concerned that by 2030, China might be dominant. So how that kind of relationship at that time could be. So in the next 2 decades, leading to 2030, US may work more to hedge against China's rising. Pivoting back in Asia, rebalancing, that would hurt China's interest. So China wants to assure the US, no need to work on me this way, as I'm not going to challenge your presence in East Asia, in West Pacific. So China tried to present this. Don't hurt me, and I would assure you I'm not going to challenge you. So let's have more respect for an equal partnership. But I think the US has some difficulty, that the US would have very great difficulty in being equal with anyone else. US sees a reason in tapping Chancellor Merkel. So US-German relationship, despite one of the best within NATO alliance, is not equal. So how US would not tap China's information and internal working? But the US is willing to expand relationship with China in a more cooperative way. So when China proposed let's work on new model, new type of major power relationship. President Obama did not accept immediately. In return, he mentioned, let's work on new cooperation instead of new type of great power relationship. So the U.S. has difficulty in my taking this relationship should be equal. U.S. still thinks there is only one good modality that China has to follow, and China is not totally doing this. U.S. has patience in working with China, but still cannot accept this kind of modality. This is how I see. And then U.S. has difficulty in seeing China's urgent need, try to be equal. Even China would say, I'm not going to challenge you, but why you want to be an equal partner? Therefore, these days, to what I read, China has moderated, watered down the term to call new model of big country relationship. We no longer call great power. So I'm a big country, you are a big country. You are a great power. My heart considers that I'm a great power. But since when I talk about it openly, I'm a great power, you may be unhappy. And also Japan, India, many other countries will be unhappy. Why you two are great power, we are not? So China tried to be more accommodating by rephrasing this term to bigger country. That's very strange. In the term of international relations, the jargon is great power, not a bigger country. But China tried to be more moderate.
I wanted to ask you both about that, but maybe, Paul, in your response, you could address that issue. I noticed that too. We've switched from the great, new type relationship between great powers to a new type relationship between
big country,
big countries. But has the Chinese changed as well? I think the Chinese.
We changed.
I've known Shen DINGLI since 1998 when I was an army captain traveling in China. And I was traveling with my mother in Shanghai, and I wanted to meet with Professor Shen DINGLI, and I didn't have anything to do with my mother, and so I asked him if I could bring her to the meeting, and he said yes. And I've known since that time that he's a wonderful man, and I very much appreciate it. But because we've known each other for such a long time, and we're very close, I can disagree with him a little bit, and I'm going to do that here. I have a different view on the Xinxin Dagua Guanqi, the new type of great power relations. I think there is some concern. This got a lot of attention in the United States when Xi Jinping traveled to the United States as vice president on his trip. And he used this phrase. And frankly, I think most Americans didn't know what to make of it. But one of the things that they understood was that since 1500, there are 15 cases where a rising power, where the dynamic between a rising power and established power take place, and of those 15 cases, 11 have resulted in some sort of conflict. And so I think from a positive standpoint, the American side thought this is an attempt by Xi Jinping and the leadership to try to find a framework that would avoid that. And of course, the American side, this is something that is also in its interest. However, there are some concerns on the American side of this slogan, new type of great power relations. Some see it as an effort in China to simply gain more respect in the international community, to be treated more as an equal, and to get the United States to agree to its core interests. These are areas where the U.S. and China, many of them are areas where the U.S. and China have disagreed for a long time, to get the United States to concede to those core interests overnight. And those Americans that are worried about this, many of them say we should disregard this proposal by Xi Jinping. But I would argue that many more, including the U.S. government and the leadership, and I see what President Obama said at Sunnylands very differently than my friend Shen DINGLI. I do not see it as objecting to or not accepting this new concept. I think what the American side wants to do is explore what this new type of great power relationships means for our two countries, and how can we actually use it as a turning point in our relationship. And what the Americans hope to do, I think, in talking to the U.S. government and other, we just had Steve Hadley out to visit our center 2 weeks ago, former U.S. National Security Advisor. And one of the things that I think is predominant in the American thinking is that given China's rise over the last 30+ years, China is now in a fundamentally different position in the world today. It is in a position to contribute to many issues which affect many countries in the world, including China. China now, for its own domestic agenda to continue to grow and develop and sustain its economy, has to rely on an international environment now that is conducive to that development. It can no longer drive its development by only thinking within its borders. And so this is something new for China. It's something new for the international community. But what's interesting is it's a new element in the U.S.-China relationship. For 30+ years, the U.S. and China relationship has primarily been about bilateral issues that the U.S. and China talk about. But now, for the first time, the United States and China need to work together on issues that are global in nature, that affect China, that affect the United States, and affect the international community. And I think there is some very positive thinking in the United States that if we can take this new type of great power relations and put cooperation on global issues at the very center of this relationship, then we can potentially, this may be a turning point, and we may be able to transform the relationship in ways where the U.S. and China are working together on global issues for the benefit of China, the United States, and the international community.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to ask maybe a little bit later for some specific suggestions from both of you about sort of areas where you think this kind of cooperation can occur. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask Professor Shen, how does the pivot to Asia, the phrase has gone out of fashion in the US government now, they call it rebalancing, they don't even talk about that so much these days. How does that tally with this new type of great power relations or major power relations? Because there seems to be a contradiction between the two. The narrative after I arrived in China in 2010 was that China was growing more assertive in the region. In response, the Obama administration came up with a pivot, a commitment to redeploy diplomatic and military resources to the region, to accelerate negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But then we had the Sunnyland Summit. Now it seems like the State Department is entirely focused on the Middle East. Where are we with the Asia pivot? Does China still see this as a threat, and is it going to be a problem in forging this new model of relations?
Well, 10 years after the U.S. started its anti-terror war, the U.S. might see that China has risen so much, and the U.S. has been mired in the two wars. And also, for the last 10 years, the U.S. may see China increasingly is conducting its maritime activity in surrounding water in a way that China would unilaterally interpret the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, not through more internationally standard interpretation. Therefore, U.S. must have some worry, because when China talks about equality, no hegemony, U.S. should treat China equally. Why China would treat America not this way in terms of the freedom of navigation in high sea, in international water? And why China is not treating its maritime neighbor per international law? So U.S. has a concern. Then U.S. has acted in a way which is called pivoting. It's comprehensive, it's not against any particular country, and it is to rebalance. Then Chinese perspective is, this must be targeted against me. It's a primarily military plus TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, to undermine China's economic rise. So China would hedge. China would conduct its rebalancing to counter. In my view, all these are unnecessary, because China would rise anyway when China has adopted market economy. would partner with the US, sooner or later it would rise. Even when China catch up with US on a par total GDP, its per capita GDP would be only some 20-25% of the US, very low. This is not undoable, but even so, it's doable. China has not done it yet. So first, it would be done. Second, without partnering with the US and many other countries, it's not doable. And China knows this. So China does not have an option to achieve this without working with other countries per international law. Third, China has some of its own legitimate national security concern, considering the case of Taiwan. Therefore, China may see the U.S. collecting of intelligence close to China's territory and territorial water may pose some challenge. Therefore, China would venture to hinder the U.S. freedom of navigation in the area close to China's territorial water. And China does not think this is something wrong. This is something that China is warranted. So I think the two countries have some views that differ, and they need to communicate. China need to understand Deng Xiaoping made a strategic decision to establish diplomatic relationship with U.S. before the Taiwan issue is settled. Meaning the U.S. could continue to sell weapons to Taiwan, and China did not make it as a condition to normalize the relationship. China could. You have to stop weapon sale. Then by this time, China and U.S. have not established a normal relationship. But China chose otherwise. It's a strategy. If this strategy has every merit, we should understand this is still not the time to disregard such a wisdom. So therefore, to call a premature rise, U.S. has to stop weapons sale to Taiwan in 2010, 3 years ago. Otherwise, China would do something may not fit the reality of Deng Xiaoping's wisdom. And the U.S. cannot accept China's behavior. China considers, with my rise, you cannot continue this bad behavior. And we need to exchange to reach some consensus. China still disagree, but we still have to do business. The more we do business, the more we have mutual stake. The more we know that we can settle some fundamental difference with time would move on. This is the value, in my view, the pivoting. Chinese side need to know why the U.S. would do pivoting. Mm-hmm. It's not just, in my personal view, U.S. want to do something to hurt China. Somehow, China has done something to excite the U.S. to do something. China has failed to understand this. That would not make the relationship for the next stage more quiet. So China needs to reflect. And the U.S. needs to reflect that since 20 years later, I would finish this anyway. Could I work on this smoothly with China in a mutually agreeable fashion, in a face-saving fashion? So mainland, Taiwan, and the U.S. would all behave in a respectful way. So I see this as a lesson of the pivoting. I have no difficulty with pivoting, and I don't see the U.S. can contain China. I think these two countries are great partners, but they need to predict how others would react upon my action.
Paul, what are your thoughts on that? Sure. And just if I can ask you to address one question as well. Isn't the calculation on the Chinese side that the whole pivot is going to run out of steam, more accurately, money? We've already, several of the elements of the pivot have been called into question, including the military deployments. Could you address that issue in your response as well?
Sure. First, let me say my own view, 我个人的看法 on the pivot is that it was rolled out poorly, that it was announced in a very loud and dramatic way, and it was led with a security effort. In fact, the language was, as the United States draws its troops down in Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. will pivot to Asia. And that's a mistake. And I would just say my own view is we have had a presence in the Asia-Pacific for 100 years. We are not coming back to Asia. We've been to Asia. We've been in Asia. We are an Asian power. And especially since the aftermath of World War II. And I would contend that U.S. presence has actually contributed in a very positive way. Security presence, economic presence, diplomatic presence has contributed in a very positive way to the growth of this region. Now, at the end of the Cold War, the United States looked around the world, just like an investment portfolio. If you have an investment portfolio with your savings, and you look around the world and you see chaos in some regions, but you look to the Asia Pacific and you see growth and dynamism. And you think to yourself, the 21st century, the prosperity will be in Asia. As a country, you want to be there. You've been there for 100 years. You want to stay there. And you want to take advantage of that growth, and you want to take advantage of the trade that's going to grow. So after the end of the Cold War, the United States said, we need to rebalance. We need to rebalance our efforts towards Asia a little bit. But what happened was 9/11. And that got us very tied down in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and much of our focus was to that area. Now, President Obama came in and said, we're going to start pulling back from those areas, and so there was a renewed effort to think about how to continue this effort to rebalance. Now, for political reasons, back home, and I think also partly to reassure our allies in the Asia-Pacific that we were not going away, there was a decision in the Obama administration to roll it out the way they rolled it out. And I think for those of us who are in China, trying to convince our Chinese friends that we're not trying to contain China, the pivot did not help. It made my job much worse. Now, are we trying to contain China? This is a question that I get asked all the time. In 1981, the United States and China had $5 billion in trade. In 2012, the United States and China had over $500 billion in trade. China is the United States' third largest trading partner, second largest source for exports, first largest source of imports. The United States has supported China's entry into international organizations, including the WTO. Every president, at least that I've worked for, has said they support a strong, prosperous, and successful China. If our strategy is to contain China, we are failing miserably. This would not be the strategy you would use if you're trying to contain or keep down a country. Now, I agree with Shen DINGLI. China's rise does create some concerns in the United States. And we are going to have to get used to the idea that China is growing, and even China's military is growing. It is natural for a country, when it has additional resources, to put some of those towards the military. But I think we need to, as Shen DINGLI said, change the way we communicate. And I think this is another part of the Xinxin Daguo Guanxi. And I think we need, and I think this was what Sunnylands was trying to do. Our official interaction between the U.S. and China is very scripted from the very senior level, between presidents and all the way down. It gets less scripted as you go down, but it's very scripted at the top. And I think the one time where I saw President Bush actually rearrange the seats in a meeting, in an official meeting, a lunch, so that he could put President Hu right next to him and have a real conversation. It was that conversation where President Bush reassured President Hu that he would remain committed to the six-party talks. And the next day, President Hu sent Tang Jia-xuen to North Korea to meet Kim Jong-il, and 6 months later, the North Koreans, we had an agreement, and 3 months later, they shut down their reactor. That's the kind of thing I think we can do if we change the way we communicate. And the last thing I'll say is, we also in the U.S. side, as a government, are trained to think proactively about where the U.S. and China and other countries, where we can cooperate. And we come to China with these long lists, and we say, you know, we've done an evaluation of your interests, and we've done an evaluation of our interests, and these are all the issues that we think we can work on together. Now, the problem that I've realized after living here for 4 years is that the way that's been perceived in China is the U.S. coming to China asking for help on issues that China has determined are issues that America cares about, and that America wants China to help in a way that will benefit only America. And so what I think we need to do in the U.S. government is to stop coming with long lists and say to our Chinese friends, where can we cooperate? What are the issues we can cooperate on? We need to draw out Chinese ideas, because only in that way will they be sellable here in China. Because President Xi Jinping needs to be able to say to the Chinese people, this was something that the Chinese took to the Americans as an area that they wanted, that China wants to work on for the betterment of China. And the U.S. has accepted our proposal. And I think if we can do that, that raises our chances that we can find areas to work on.
Let me just pick up on one thing you said, and then we'll come to Professor Shen. You said that the U.S., if it's trying to contain China, has not done a very good job. Arguably, it has done a pretty good job on the military front. If you're looking at it from China's perspective, you look at the alignment of U.S. forces in Asia, the so-called sort of first island chain and the second island chain. This was a presence that was set up, it dates back to the end of the Second World War. It played a key role during the Cold War in keeping Soviet forces at bay, and it's still there. It's still the same architecture, the same sort of infrastructure. And China's capabilities are now developing at such a speed that they are able to do things sort of further and further away from their own shores. Isn't it inevitable that there is going to come a point where the capabilities of China overlap with the sort of the presence of the U.S. and the only solution will be either for the U.S. to pull back somewhat, or there'll have to be some kind of some kind of confrontation.
It's a very, very good question, and let me answer it two ways. One is both the United States and China have hedging strategies towards each other. The United States looks at China's military and thinks, what happens if things with China develop in ways that are inimical to U.S. interests, and what can we do to react to that? But if you look at China's military modernization, they have developed a number of capabilities that are specifically geared towards taking out the United States in a scenario that involves the United States in the Asia Pacific. So militaries, I was in the military, and I worked in the Pentagon. We get paid to do worst case assessments. We get paid to look at the other side and say, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? And do we have the capability to respond to that? Now, that will be an element of our relationship probably forever. But what we have to watch out for is that when the tension is high, and when the trust is low and the communication is low, then the hedging element of our strategies tend to dominate the relationship, not the cooperative engagement. And we need to shift the balance to get the balance back down so that, we each have our hedging strategies, but they're in the background. And that the dominant feature of our relationship is establishing greater cooperation on global issues. The second point I would make is, to do that, we have to fundamentally change the way our militaries communicate. And unfortunately now the mil-to-mil relationship lags furthest behind all other elements of, if you think about the economic relationship between the U.S. and China, and then you compare that to the military-to-military relationship, it's dismal. It's a problem. Now, fortunately, I think President Xi Jinping has a different view. I think he wants to build the trust because of this idea of avoiding the historical, cases where rising powers come into contact with it. I think he visited the Pentagon. He was the first vice president to visit the Pentagon when he went to the United States. And I think he wants to build that. And I think that will be an important element.
Thank you. Professor Shen, can I get your views specifically on that issue of the military sort of confrontation in Asia?
Well, each stakeholder has its own view. U.S. view is to safeguard the status quo, the peace and security in the West Pacific. And China may totally accept this. China's view is that the U.S. relationship with Taiwan has actually hurt Chinese and made the two parts across Taiwan Strait unable to unify. So it's a U.S. fault. China is peaceful, but at the cost of non-unification. So this is Pax America peace and security in the interest of America and hurting China. China wants to have something, peace and security, at no such cost, but and without hurting America. So China's view could be different from the US. But what China needs, US may be concerned. China wants to have mainland Chinese system imposed on Taiwan, and then spread over to Southeast Asian country, as China somehow did in 1960s and 70s. And China may expand its influence to more and more countries, dominate the region, and it's expanding America. Therefore, the Pax Syndica actually create peace and security in Chinese term, but hurting American interests. This is peace and security order cannot be accepted. So they both want to have peace and security, but in their respective term. And these terms are somehow different. But with globalization, with a common approach to market economy, they define more common interesting economic investment area, but not in military area. Therefore, when you suggest that the US may still take a policy to contain China, and Paul's view is if there is ever such a policy, it has not succeeded. I would say U.S. has a policy. I would not call containment. In Chinese term, 牵制, restraining. I would not say contain. I would say China is not containable, too big to contain. And you see, Turkish government wants to buy Chinese missile defense system, exactly due to the U.S. restraining policy. So China has nowhere to buy. China has to buy a Russian version, reverse engineering, and put in some of Chinese technological innovation, and to sell. So one NATO country wants to buy this system. If the U.S. is gracious in supplying similar technology to China, as it would supply to some of its allies, China would behave like India, have no chance to have the decision to build a domestically indigenous system. So it's exactly due to the U.S. restraining. China became more independent for national defense. So thanks to the U.S. policy, we grow. But with such a growth, U.S. would do more to restrain. So interaction. Unhealthy. I would endorse what Paul has mentioned. We need to act in a way to give more substance to the so-called new mode of greater power relation. I would say it's a great power. U.S. certainly great power. China for 5,000 years is great power. We occasionally were not great power, but now we are still great power. Second economy in the world, how it's not a great power. But we should assure the U.S. we grow due to the U.S. cooperation, for which we are grateful. And we have a long, long way to go, another 50 years to go, to continue to grow. For another half a century, we need the U.S. as a buddy. How we should return North Korea, we should have more cooperation rather than mutual hedging. Iran, they have a great new president, Rouhani. So China should more support Iran to denuclearize. And with the possible U.S. withdrawal of GIs from Afghanistan next year, I was in Moscow yesterday to discuss Russia cooperation. How our three countries in the UN framework, our China, Afghanistan one-on-one, can do more to stabilize the region. As otherwise, China can be hurt, and this will be a place to nurture anti-American capability in the future. So no good for China and the US. And climate change. China ought to do a lot more to curtail its CO2 emission, and we should build more efficiency, burning energy, releasing less CO2, making Beijing blue sky. So a lot to do. So if we can do one or two big things a year, leading to the next 10 years, we will do 10, 20 big items. I think China and US would build far more trust. That's the way. We should not only talk rhetoric, we should act.
Can I just step in on one thing you mentioned there? I mean, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, some US officials, when their Chinese counterparts put across the argument that you've just outlined, they say, we're ready for China to be a great power, to reclaim the role that it has had in the past and it rightfully should have in the future. But that entails taking on greater responsibilities and solving some of these global problems. You mentioned Afghanistan. There's a huge question mark now over what role China is exactly going to play. It doesn't want to send Chinese troops into Afghanistan. It doesn't really have paramilitary forces it can send in. How will it contribute to the security of Afghanistan?
First, more generically, given our rights, we ought to shoulder more responsibility. As we are great power. Great power will not live for itself. It provides security and prosperity for a neighboring country and the region and the entire world. That entitle us great power status and making others to accept the rights of China. And before our economic rights, we used to export revolution. Per our then view, we are great power, so we share lead. And that collapsed. Now we have more resources, more money, but we become less gracious in providing resource for free for others. We need to fix this. Probably, if I were leader, I would push for making a law. Each year, how much percentage of China's wealth should be spent for other country? 1%, 4% per the UN Millennium target. China's current GDP is per capita 6,000. Reaching 8,000, China would no longer enjoy the privilege to be waived for 80% for paying its fee to the UN. So China would significantly increase its UN fee. Japan currently pays 16 to 18%, US 21%, China pays probably 3%, but our GDP is bigger than Japan. If we no longer will be waived, we may pay 18% to the UN. That would, probably in 3 years, that would fundamentally rerouse China's thinking. Because we pay so much, why we would not play a great leadership role in the United Nations? We should send more diplomats. Taking more position in the United Nations system, acting in a international public servant, but China would benefit. Therefore, China would be more open to find its responsibility and its leadership position. Then turn to your question, Afghanistan. I do not know what my country will do. I know we are training the police in Afghanistan. And we appreciate the USGI protecting our coal mine. So in the future, if the US would withdraw, what we can do? We have to send our security force, quasi-security force, possibly. So we have a lot need to do to refigure our international relations. In the past, we never used our rights to send our Marine to protect our embassy and consulate. Now we are sending to protect our diplomats in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in the future, we may send more and more. We behave more normally. We have stake everywhere. We are hated. We are loved. So we need to send our security staff to protect our government people and people everywhere. Therefore, we are a normal country, a big country. So, given stakes, we have to get a benefit, and also give benefit to others. This is what China needs to reflect. Why just U.S. would have pivoting? Partly, in my view, we are refusing the U.S. request to shoulder the responsibility. And we are not as gracious as what we used to do in 1960 and 70. Now we should do more to deserve our great power status.
Well, can I get your response to that? And I'm particularly interested in the Afghanistan question, what you think, whether that's an opportunity for China to shoulder some of its global responsibilities.
Sure. I'll come to that. I just want to respond to a couple things. I think, Professor Shen talked about a U.S. policy of restraining China, and I'm going to take a very different view on that as well. I think we have to make a distinction between U.S. policy and the rhetoric coming out of the U.S. or sentiment that you hear. The U.S. is a very open and transparent system, and so you hear a lot of opinions and a lot of different sentiments. And yes, our country is coming to terms with the idea that China is rising. But from a policy standpoint, and I spent 5 years in the White House and worked for the National Security Advisor, and I can tell you that at the policy level, there's no illusion that the United States can somehow slow China down or block China's rise. From a policy standpoint, it makes no sense. Now, in China, I think you are having the same debates about the United States, but they're behind closed doors at the Great Hall of the People and in Zhongnanhai, and we don't hear them as much. But I sit around the dinner table with my Chinese friends, and they talk honestly. I know there's a debate about, the United States and China relationship. So I think it's very important. So this idea that we're trying to make Taiwan look like the United States, I'm sure there are many Americans in the United States who, if they woke up in the morning and looked at Taiwan and it was exactly like the United States, they might be happy. But we don't have a policy to do that. People say the U.S. policy is to overthrow the North Korean regime. There are people in the United States who, if they woke up in the morning, they'd be happy if the North Korean regime was overthrown. But the U.S. does not have an active policy to overthrow the regime. So there's a difference between views coming out of the United States and what policy is. I think that's an important thing. That we have decided in the United States, from a policy standpoint, we are going to work with the China that is, not with the China that we want it to be. And that's a very important point. China has a very different political system than us. Now, are there people who think that China would be better with a different political system? Sure. But from a policy standpoint, we don't have an active policy to change China's system. We're going to work with the China that is here today and hope that China evolves the way Chinese people want it to. I just want to, before we get to Afghanistan, I just want to say one thing that I really agree with Shen DINGLI on, is this idea to find some headline initiatives that the United States and China can work on together to show that by the United States, China working together, that it's helping Chinese people and it's helping American people, because then the Chinese president can sell it to the Chinese people and the American president can sell it to the American people. Things like, for example, one of the ideas that Steve Hadley, the former National Security Advisor, brought with him when he was visiting China was an idea for the United States and China to work together to eradicate a childhood disease where Chinese children are dying and American children are dying. But the United States and China come together and find a cure that helps Chinese and it helps Americans. If we can do more of this, I think that we can help change the views of our own peoples. And they're bad in both China and the United States. On the issue of China's foreign policy, my own sense is that as China grows, as China becomes more influential and takes a more powerful position, its own interests will change. And it will need to take a more active role in the international community, and you talked a lot about that. But the United States also is conflicted, because on one side it wants to enhance global cooperation, but on the other hand, it gets worried about China's involvement in Africa, or China's involvement in Latin America, or China's growing military. So we also need to come to terms with it. And I think if we can enhance our communications, if we can find areas to work together, this will allow our two countries to begin to build greater trust, not think the worst of each other, and find areas to cooperate. I think Afghanistan, I don't know, that's a tougher question. But on Syria, what I tell my Chinese friends is, I wish it was China that came up with the idea that Russia came up with. I wish China was more active in those discussions about what to do in the aftermath of a chemical attack in Syria. Because I read in the newspapers here in China that President Obama was using the chemical attack as justification to use military force, because the United States has always wanted to use military force in Syria. Well, in fact, in retrospect, President Obama did not want to use military force. He was looking for anything but. It was a real opportunity, I think, for the Chinese and the Americans to come together and say, we both have stakes in this. China's dependence in the Middle East is growing. And so imagine if that idea was a Chinese idea and the U.S. and China had worked on it together. I think that could have been very powerful for our relationship and could have put China in a very positive light.
Sure. Do you want to respond to that?
I truly hope, I echo you, that Chinese side would propose something that Russia has proposed. U.S. first need to prod on Assad regime. Second, not want to have a war. So China need to behave like a major power, which is creative in diplomacy, proposing something to meet both ends, prodding Syria and without a war. And our president and your president can get a Nobel Peace Prize together. Obama get 2, and we get 1.
What an excellent, excellent discussion. I would take the prerogative as the convener to ask a question to all of our discussants today. Give me some examples, a recommendation of a trust-building exercise you would have the Committee of 100 do to improve, to enhance, including Germany.
Let me start. I think each problem presents an opportunity. Cyber, U.S. has lots of problems with China. Thanks to Snowden, U.S. would have less moral reason why you look at me, because we know U.S. will also look at us. But the suspicion still is there. U.S. may not be in a better position to charge China, but the U.S. still feels uncomfortable that Chinese are conducting some of such a business. So this is a problem. Without removing the problem, our two countries still have greater suspicion. Hard to build a trust. So to me, let's address this issue, dividing security and economy. For security, it's very hard for U.S. not to monitor China. And my government has denied that we have done anything to monitor U.S., but probably we are doing.
Oh, yeah.
But for those crucial economic infrastructure area, finance, energy, electricity, banking, how the two sides can negotiate to make a bilateral code of conduct with a certain verification. And if this would be successful, let's sail together this to other countries to make a global code of conduct. Then China, U.S. not only resolve our bilateral suspicion, but also behave as a great power in stabilizing the world.
So, Angie, I think that was a great question. Before I ask, I want to just respond to one thing I can't let go on the cyber espionage. You know, the Snowden issue was damaging to U.S. national security, but I argue that in the U.S.-China context, it's helpful because it helps us clarify what the American side is really talking about. Snowden is talking about cyber espionage, listening to other governments, those kind of things. I was here at the U.S. Embassy twice. All countries do the same thing. Believe me, all countries do the same thing. So what Snowden is talking about is something that the entire world countries are doing to each other. We may do it more, I don't know. I've never sort of done that kind of analysis. But what the American side is getting upset about, and what the U.S. business community in China is growing increasingly upset about, is having their commercial and trade secrets stolen through cyber activities. And this is something that I think China, as it innovates and begins to develop, much more of its own innovation and technology, will also begin to care about. So this is, in fact, we think it's an area of tension. It should actually be an area of cooperation, because I think we both have interest in this. To Angie's question, I think that the Committee of 100 is a fantastic place to explore the kind of headline initiatives that Steve Hadley, the former National Security Advisor, talked about when he was here. Because you have such incredible, talented people as members of your organizations from a variety of different fields. And if you can explore through your members, the areas where headline initiatives in each of the different areas, whether it's business and science and medicine, what are those things that could be headline initiatives where U.S. and China can work together, make progress in a way that benefits China and the U.S., and makes the headlines so that we can begin to change the tone of our relationship to a more positive one.